I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to take a call on part 2 of this bill, and in particular I'd like to speak to my supplementary order paper on this part of the bill. But Mr Chair, I have to say I was disappointed that the Minister, when he took his last call, rather than focusing on part 2 of the bill and the questions that we raised, instead decided to go back to the 1980s, Mr Chair, and dwell instead on other issues. He seems to, like most of the National Party members over there, have an obsession with the 90s, 80s, Mr Chair, as though members on this side of the House have forgotten our own history. We know our history, Mr Chair, we do. And I don't often quote Winston Churchill, I don't, but I will. Winston Churchill once famously said, "When the facts change, I change my mind." What do you do, sir? Well, the facts are on the table when it comes to asset sales. We learned our lesson. We have moved on from our alternative position of the 80s. We learnt our lesson, and now we're challenging the national government to learn that lesson also, rather than repeat the errors of old. So I will ask again, in lieu of Mr Ryle having picked up on the questions that we asked to be addressed, again, why is there no penalty for exceeding the 10% cap? That wasn't covered by Mr Ryle. And also, Tūwhare Toa's concerns, which are extremely legitimate, which were raised at Select Committee over their rights not being protected by the changes that the government has made within this bill. That was not addressed by Mr Ryle and the Chair, and so I ask instead whether Minister Tolley and please address for those House those two very legitimate concerns that are being raised, in particular on behalf of the people of Tūwhare Toa. But Mr Chair, I'd like to speak to the supplementary order paper in my name, which refers to the way in which companies, the companies in question will be referred to or characterised in this bill, and that's particularly relevant to part 2, which even begins with the heading "Ongoing Provision for Mixed Ownership Model Companies." Now, my SOP, Mr Chair, changes that title, changes the reference to mixed ownership model companies, and instead proposes that that be replaced in all areas in which it is referred to with the title "Privatisation of Public Property Company." Now, the reason for that, Mr Chair, is because we want to bring some transparency to this bill through the way that some of these companies are referred to, because we believe that the use of the word partial is quite misleading. Now, I want to delve into why that is, Mr Chair, in my address. Well, first of all, the use of the word partial mixed ownership model company implies that a retention of the status quo, that somehow the use of partial privatisation will still lend itself towards the outcomes which we already have. Now, I think a lot of the debate in part 1 lent itself to suggesting why that will not be the case for those companies which are addressed in part 2. And why is that? Well, because mixed ownership models, which of course include partial privatisation by default, often can equate to the whole. Changing partially the way something operates can, in effect, change the way the whole beast operates. And it doesn't matter whether it's 40%, 51% or 100%, that can be the case. And we have some historic examples, Mr Chair, where that certainly has been the case. I want to reflect on what happened, for instance, with the way that over time the old Forestry Service was altered in the way that it operated. The Forestry Service obviously had been around for some time. When in the 1980s it was transferred to the Forestry Corp. And when it was transferred, Mr Chair, to the Forestry Corp, which had a different set of objectives, that again tried to create a bit of a mixed model in a sense, it abandoned the objectives that were set in 1976, which are around the environment, the economy and employment. So in 1976, those were some of the extra things that were added to the old objectives, I think, of something like 1930s. But then in the 80s, all of that was dumped. It was dumped for the pure notion of a profit imperative. Now, at that point, the partial really overtook the whole in the way that that was going to be managed. Contractors were brought in replace of those who were full-time employees. Assets were sold off. And in fact, it gets very, very interesting when we see a debate, Mr Chair, that happened during this sort of mixed model that exists, Mr Chair, where a debate ensued, and I believe this was in the very late 80s, early 90s, between the newly formed Forestry Corp and the government over the land, the value of the forestry on its books, over the value of the land. Now, you'll be interested to know, Mr Chair and members of the House, that the way that Forestry Corp, with its pure profit imperative, decided to resolve this dispute it was having with the government over the value of this land, the way it resolved this dispute was to just sell it. Was just to sell the land. That was the way that that dispute was resolved. There we had an attempt to bring together some different ways of operating, some different MOs. But at the end of the day, the overriding imperative at that time was profit. The partial became the whole. And Mr Chair, that's why we believe that the use of this mixed ownership model company turn of phrase implies something that's actually very difficult to achieve. In the same way that we pointed out that the removal of the OIA provisions is because even though there's still a state interest in these companies, the overriding interest of shareholders has taken over the way that it will operate. For instance, also, you could potentially get sued if these companies don't pursue the singular goal of the shareholder, which will be profit. So again, proving that mixed does not mean that the imperatives of the state will override the interests of shareholders. So again, implying that a mixed ownership model is very difficult to operate. If we even look into the way that partial is, and I thought this would be an interesting exercise, no one else may agree with me, but if you look into the way that this idea of partial is even referred to in the dictionary, or people's common understanding, it says affecting only a part. Can you affect only part of a board? Can you affect only part of a dam? It's incredibly difficult to do. I did in fact see an example of the use of the word partial. Quotes, plan used in order to explain the way that partial can be used. The plans called for the partial deployment of missiles. I quite like that. How do you partially deploy missiles? How do you partially privatise an asset? You either privatise it or you don't. And I think that that's been the point that we're making, which is why my supplementary order paper amends a little bit pregnant. Yes, that's why my supplementary order paper makes the amendment to replace the mixed ownership model company with privatisation of public property companies. Because there is also an irony in the fact that partial, of course, is also a reference to favouring one person or side, and I think that's a point that we've made very strongly in this debate. But the notion of privatisation, Mr Chair, which is what we intend to replace the references to mixed ownership model companies in Part 2 with privatisation of public property companies, is because that plays very much to the understanding of the public over the meaning of privatisation. And that is, of course, the process of transferring ownership from the public sector to the private sector. It doesn't make any, it doesn't quibble over the proportion by which you do that, whether or not it's a mixed model or whether or not there's a partial and profit imperative or the complete loss of social responsibility imperatives. It is the notion of whether or not something is being transferred from one form of ownership to another. That is privatisation, and that is what this bill does. And so if we are truly, Mr Chair, being transparent to the public over what this bill put forward by the government does, then we should surely enact that transparency over the way that these companies are referred to in Part 2 by no longer referring them as mixed ownership model companies and replacing it with privatisation of public property companies. In fact, I'd like to extend a challenge to the Minister and the Chair, that if in fact she stands by these companies still being called mixed ownership model companies, then to give us the true definition, the difference in definition between the way that a mixed ownership model company will substantively operate that is different to the way, for instance, those private electricity retailers currently operate. For example, can she give us the differences, substantive differences between the way that this model will operate versus those current the private electricity retailers in New Zealand, because I would be very interested in those differences. And if the Minister and the Chair cannot demonstrate to us that there are any substantive differences, then my SOP should stand, and that is the renaming of mixed ownership model companies.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Chairman.